A very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Coffee House Experience. I would request all our listeners and viewers to circle back to the point where India became an independent nation. The nation had a number of models to choose from with regard to the electoral and economic systems it could look to emulate. On one hand, it could go the US way, that is, a mix of Western style democracy and free markets. It could also adopt the Soviet model, which was essentially a mix of top-down central planning coupled with a polity that could, for all practical purposes, be described as a dictatorship. And the Cold War consensus that was prevailing at that point of time ensured that the two systems were mutually considered to be incompatible with each other. India, interestingly, chose an amalgam of the two, Western-style democracy and Soviet-inspired top-down economic planning. To shed light on this aspect of India's early years, especially the fact that planning shaped the early economic experience of India, we have with us Professor Nikhil Menon from the University of Notre Dame. He's a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the political and economic history of 20th century India. His research explores the histories of democracy and development in independent India. His latest book, Planning Democracy, Modern India's Quest for Development, will form the basis for today's discussion. Quite expectedly, one man will feature frequently in today's discussion, and that's Professor PC Mahalanobis, founder of the Indian Statistical Institute. Welcome, Nikhil.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy, and Pratyay, thank you for having me on the Coffee House Experience.
Sure. It's our pleasure.
Just for your viewers, this is the book, in case people are wondering.
Great. So as a starting point, it would be great if you could probably set out the lay of the land, if you will, for us, especially in terms of the incentives that the leaders at the helm of Indian affairs were meted with in those early years. Why did they essentially choose to embrace this dichotomy, which is Western democracy versus top-down central economic planning? If you could shed some light on that.
Absolutely. Thank you. So broadly, this book, Planning Democracy, is about a grand adventure that India embarks upon in 1947 after independence, after nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule, where India is trying to combine, during the Cold War, both, as you said, liberal Western-style democracy and Soviet-inspired centralized economic planning. And the idea was that India would be unique in amongst developing and decolonizing nations in trying to sort of bridge this Cold War divide. And this was seen by not just Indians, but many international observers as quite a quixotic experiment, because of course, the Cold War's fundamental attitude was that these were incompatible, right? That you could not have these two together, that if you had a centralized planning mechanism, that you had to have a totalitarian government. Or that if you had a democratic system in terms of a parliament, then you had to have free markets. Whereas India was trying to combine this, and as I argue in the book, actually it became something that was quite common then through the 1950s and 1960s for many countries to put together different sort of ingredient lists of democracy and centralized planning. And so my book is an attempt to try to recover how plans became so central to the idea of modern India, something that I think we've lost sight of. Yes, our economic policies have gone in a different direction, but I think that we've also forgotten how central the ideas of plans and 5-year plans were to the conception of modern India, how they became quite mainstream in the views of political parties of different persuasions, right? So right from the Hindu right to the communist left, all of these political parties believed in some kind of planning. They believed in different kinds of specific policies, but all of it was talked about in the notion, in the language of planning. So I go even further back before independence to talk about how figures like Tagore on the one hand, or Bose on the other, or Nehru, or capitalists like G.D. Birla or J.R.D. Tata, people we would not think of as votaries of planning, all of them were endorsing planning, right? Amongst scientists, Visvesvaraya was endorsing planning from the late 1920s. Meghnad Saha was endorsing planning as well. And so we have to, I think, what my book attempts to do is to try to recapture this moment in which planning was just sort of loomed very large in people's minds, and to try to understand how is it that planning seeped into things such as not just the economy, but into politics, but also, as I discussed later in my book, into popular culture as well. Why is it that Mohammad Rafi and Asha Bhosle are singing songs about 5-year plans? Why is it that movies by K. Abbas, in which Dilip Kumar is featuring, or Shami Kapoor is featuring, why are these movies, mainstream popular movies, why do they have planning themes? Why do they talk about Panchvarsha Yojanas or 5-year plans in them? So in some ways, it's a way to try to contend with this forgotten aspect of India's past that was quite central to India between 1947 and as recently as 2014.
Right.
Moving forward from there, it would be great if you could probably shed some light on the ideological underpinnings that led to the formation of the Planning Commission. What was its envisaged role? And I think people in India now probably don't remember the Planning Commission as much, especially peers of ours who probably have seen it only in the early years. What the Niti Aayog now is essentially a think tank of sorts. But that's about it. The Planning Commission was much more powerful than that. So if you could kindly expand on that.
Absolutely. So the ideological underpinnings of planning in India go back a long way. And so I'd say perhaps one of the earliest inspirations for the role of a stable central government leading an economy comes from the Meiji Restoration in Japan in 1869. But from then onwards, you see, because Meiji Restoration is an inspiration to Indians, because it's one of the first Asian economies that is suddenly able to match European economies, right? It beats Russia in a war in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, and this is seen as a major achievement for an Asian economy. And the fact that an Asian economy is able to industrialize, it was the first Asian economy to industrialize, right? So with the Meiji Restoration in Japan, then in the early 20th century with Russia, the Soviet Union's first 5-year plans in the mid-1920s, you see again what a sort of overwhelmingly poor and agrarian country, which is what India was, suddenly industrializing, right? So we have to see that to India, the models could not be, or it was not seen as realistic to look at the United States or Britain as models. One is that they were seen as our oppressors, but secondly, they were already developed and industrialized nations. So how do you leapfrog there? We needed a model that of a country that didn't take 200 years to industrialize, like both the US and Britain did. We needed a model that, in a sense, could get us there much faster. And Japan and Soviet Union seemed to do that. Planning then becomes more acceptable in the 1930s when even a capitalist country like America, after the Great Depression of 1929, adopts the New Deal under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of America at the time, who introduces a lot of economic controls and state-led sort of economic organizations, which leads to people saying that this is also a kind of economic planning as well, right? So the idea that the state would play a major role, even at the heart of the capitalist system, becomes well-grounded. And then, of course, you have the outbreak of the Second World War, during which both on the Axis and Allied powers, the wartime economies are such that the state plays an overwhelming role. That's true of Britain-controlled India. That's true of Hitler-controlled Germany, fascist Italy, Britain, wartime Britain under Churchill, but also FDR-controlled America at the time. So much so that when Churchill was actually voted out of power in 1945, and when the Labour government is voted into power in Britain under Clement Attlee, the Labour manifesto, the election campaign manifesto, talks about this government wanting to be a socialist government and wanting to have a planned economy, right? So now you have a situation where the government in charge of the most vast empire in the world is stating its beliefs in the planned economy. And it's also a capitalist economy. So that's I think the ideological underpinning in which, when the Congress Party is advocating planning in India from the late 1930s onwards, it's not seen as a sort of, as an off-the-wall idea. It's not seen as coming from, way left field. It's seen as quite a mainstream policy choice. And that's the thing that we need to remember today, that today, if India were to adopt 5-year plans, that would be a non-mainstream policy choice. But at the time, this is what most developing economies were seen as. In fact, even developed economies were seen as moving towards different kinds of economic planning. And at the time, in the 1940s and 1950s, this is the period in which development economics as a discipline itself is growing, right? We have to remember that development economics has not existed forever. Before that, it was, in the 19th century, the entire field was referred to as political economy. Development economics sort of defines itself as a subfield only from the 1940s onward. And the initial generation of development economists all say that for developing nations, the state needs to play a very important role. Now, some of them explicitly advocate planning. Some of them don't explicitly advocate planning, but they all say that these countries need some kinds of, either import substitution, some kinds of protections of their economy, and that they need to have the state playing a very major role. So that's the sort of broad international background in which India's decision comes to make most sense. That if you were to poll economists at the time, they would say that, yeah, broadly, these are the ideas. And I think it's only in that context that you can understand why somebody like G.D. Birla or J.R.D. Tata, arch capitalists, would have a view that is quite similar to, in the broad sort of aspects, not in the details, to somebody like Bose or Nehru, right? The people who you would think might otherwise be at loggerheads with each other. And so in 1938, Subhash Chandra Bose, after sending this telegram to Nehru, who's abroad at the time, and I recount this, sends this very affectionate sort of letter to Nehru saying, we want to set up a national planning committee, and I think that you would be the best person to be in charge of it. And in a sign of how people who at different times disagreed with each other still had respect for each other, and as opposed to what today's a lot of people today try to sort of pit Bose versus Nehru and Ambedkar versus Nehru and Patel versus Nehru. Bose ends that letter by saying, "Yours affectionately, Subhash." Right. So it's a time in which these people seem to think of each other as comrades and engaged in a common enterprise. And the common enterprise here is the National Planning Committee, which Nehru then heads from 1938 onwards, and which produces a bunch of reports. Of course, it's interrupted by the fact that the Second World War comes in between. All of them go into jail for different periods of time. But basically, when India becomes independent, then Nehru, as prime minister, puts into effect some of those recommendations. The major one was something that actually Bose had talked about even before setting up this committee, which is that of setting up a centralized agency, which became eventually the Planning Commission.
If we look at the current public discourse, there is a tendency among economists and other people to somehow say that all these things we have done before 1991. It's kind of all wrong, right? It held back the economy. It was like basically nothing was happening, no productivity. And 1991, this liberalization happened, and after that, sort of it flourished. So, but do you think, looking back, had it been like the other way, there was no planning? I mean, of course, it's like kind of crystal balling at this point. But do you think there is a tendency to sort of ignore the important aspects of planning? Like, for example, in terms of the educational institutes we have, like a tertiary education at least, that we have the IITs, that are kind of very good institutes that you established, that kind of all happened because of this 5-year planning, right? So we should probably recognize them. What's your thoughts?
I think that's an important question. I think that a lot gets lost in this debate, and I think sometimes economists are careful to nuance their position on this, but I think that the public, when we access it, we forget the nuance. And I think that you're right to say that the common perception is that 5-year plans were a disaster. They were the worst thing to have happened. India should have liberalized its economy in 1950 itself. The first thing I'd say to that is that if Nehru was to do that, he would be going against every expert. Is that something that you want your prime minister to be doing? We saw what happened with demonetization when a prime minister makes a decision without any expert, input. It would have been a radical decision to do something that no expert was suggesting, that nobody on your political opposition was recommending either, that was seen as in some ways almost anti-patriotic, right? Because at the time, after coming out after 200 years of colonialism, capitalism in a sense was tainted with colonialism. That's the thing that I think a lot of us
imperialism in some sense, like kind of imperialism.
Exactly, capitalism and imperialism were twinned in the minds of Indians, because it was an imperialist power that was capitalist and claimed itself to be capitalist that had been running the show in India. And so to adopt that very same attitude at a time in which India's terms of trade were so poor with Britain, to do the same thing again would have seemed sort of suicidal. The other thing that I think we need to keep in mind, and I think that this is something that economists, when economists are having a sort of more detailed discussions about it, will admit is that, and I write about this in this book, is that even the people who are today associated with believing in the markets, believing in free markets, believing in liberalization, what did they believe at the time, right? It's one thing to believe it today, but
Right.
who are, say, two of the most famous Indian economists who believe in the free market? Manmohan Singh and Jagdish Bhagwati, right? Jagdish Bhagwati even more so.
Right.
Jagdish Bhagwati worked for the Planning Commission. Jagdish Bhagwati was in Oxford when the professor, PC Mahalanobis, showed up. Jagdish Bhagwati, in his own interview, says that he was awestruck. And when the professor asked him to be one of his boys in Delhi, he said, I was more than happy to leave my scholarship in Oxford and be one of the professor's boys. And he himself says that, maybe one of the curses that India had was to have a stable of brilliant economists. And because he said that, and he says, and I quote, all of us drunk the Kool-Aid at the time. We all believed in this model. So even someone who's a critic of planning today, when he was a young economist, believed in it. Manmohan Singh, similarly, from the late 1960s onwards, starts publishing papers, including in EPW, about how India should have a more sort of export-led model. But in the 1950s and 60s, he too, he writes, says that at the time, this is just the common consensus. This was the consensus view amongst almost all economists. So whether it's Amartya Sen, Manmohan Singh, Jagdish Bhagwati, all of them believed in this at the time. Even today, for example, Bibek Debroy, who is very much a critic of planning, he works for the present government, which is very much a critic of planning, has worked with the Niti Aayog. Bibek Debroy himself, in a piece in the Economic Times a few years ago, says that, yes, we should critique planning, but maybe we should be more specific in which parts of the plans we critique. And he says that things really went bad after the mid-1960s. And actually, Pratyay, like you say, he says that we have actually a lot to thank for in the 1950s and 1960s in terms of setting up higher educational institutions. He specifically mentions the establishment of an industrial base, which India did not have, but India invested in the 1950s and 60s. Niranjan Rajadaksha, who's a popular financial columnist who writes for the Mint, etc. He is also very much a critique. I would say he would describe himself perhaps as a libertarian in terms of his views on the economy, but certainly a liberal. And he also says, that the policy choices at the time were much more constrained. That it is hard to imagine any other prime minister at the time making a very radically different choice. And what we need to remember is that between 1900 and 1950, India's annual growth rate was less than 1% under colonialism. Between 1950 and 1970, it quadruples to 4%. That is a significant change, right? And so we have to give that its due. Now, but that does not mean that we have to foreclose debates about whether within planning, could India have had a more efficient style? Could the license permit Raj have been avoided in the late 1960s and 70s and 80s? Could India, for example, within planning have had an export-led model instead of an import substitution model? Because the export-led model, of course, is what Japan pursued in the 1960s, South Korea pursued, Malaysia pursued, and to very different results, right? Even China, from 1979 onwards, with Deng Xiaoping, it sort of, with plans, China, of course, still has plans, but it has an export-led model, right? So those, I think, debates worth having. So to say that India's plans provided something important and to say that it's hard to imagine India not choosing to plan is not the same as saying that all of those choices within planning were very good. It's just to say that we need to recover a context in which this was a very mainstream choice, in which it would be hard to imagine how a prime minister of a large political party at the time would have chosen a route that did not have the state playing a very important role.
Moving on, I think it's high time we focus on the man at the center of Indian planning, which is the professor himself, Professor PC Mahalanobis. It would be great, Nikhil, if you could walk us through the different facets of his personality briefly, and we could probably focus on his thrust towards technocratic planning, his dalliances with Yojana Bhavan, setting up the ISI, his conception of the economy, etc., etc.
Absolutely. So PC Mahalanobis, Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, is a figure who in some ways is one of the key characters in the early part of my book. He's a figure that that I think we as Indians ought to know much more about. He was quite simply, and I think this is forgotten, he was quite simply one of the most influential Indians of his generation. His background is that of a sort of Bengali of cultural refinement, and then trains at Presidency College, and then at Cambridge, at King's College in
Brahmo
Cambridge.
Samaj as well, like the Brahmo Samaj.
Yes, of course. Right? Yeah, with the Brahmo Samaj background, yes. And then trains at Cambridge University in physics, and then on a sort of a ship ride back during the First World War back to Calcutta, he chances upon the statistical journal Biometrica and switches to studying statistics. He became, over the course of the next few decades, a global pioneer in the study of large-scale sample surveys, which he conducted through the Indian Statistical Institute, which of course he founded in the early 1930s. By the time of independence, Mahalanobis was celebrated as for his contributions to sample surveys. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, one of the first 10, 15 Indians to be inducted into it. And these large-scale sample surveys came to be used across the world from the 1950s onwards. So this is a genuine contribution made through a homegrown Indian institution to something that, say, the World Bank uses up to this day in many different countries. So over the next 2 decades after independence, from 1950 onwards, Mahalanobis would play a key role in India's national income account assessment, which was the precursors to GDP assessment. He would play a key role in setting up the Central Statistical Organization, which we still have, a key role in setting up the National Sample Survey, along with the ISI, which still we have, and which still plays a very important role in assessing poverty lines in India, employment in India, if and when the government releases and allows these reports to be released, which is something we can come to later, the sort of suppression of National Sample Survey data. And perhaps what he's most known for and what he became most influential with is the second five-year plan, which was from 1956 to 61. But those 5 years don't really capture the true extent of Mahalanobis's footprint on Indian policy, because that 5-year plan really became the template for the Indian economy right up till the market reforms of 1991. So in some ways that he is the author of India's, and so you can either give him plaudits or the brickbats for India's economy in some ways from that point onwards. One thing I'd like to address is this very common view about Mahalanobis, which is that the reason he became so influential in economic policymaking is because of the popular view is he was friends with Nehru. And I think that is and I argue in my book that that's a very, very insufficient explanation. Firstly, Nehru did not have sort of chums of that sort with who he used to, hang out with. This is a man who is very, very busy. And, I think that all politicians at that level, it's hard to argue that, either Prime Minister Modi or Prime Minister Nehru have friends who they sort of hang out with and therefore make decisions based on. So Mahalanobis is not a member of the Nehru family. He's not someone Nehru knew growing up. So where would this friendship have even occurred, right? The first time that they meet together is when actually Nehru's coming to pay a visit to Rabindranath Tagore when Tagore is writing Jana Gana Mana. And so Mahalanobis, as a friend, actual friend of Tagore and a companion of his, is at the house when Nehru visits. But Mahalanobis comes to the attention of Nehru because of Mahalanobis' sterling international reputation as a scientist, right? At the time in India, there weren't that many of them. There weren't that many internationally recognized scientists. There weren't that many who were contributing to something that might help with planning. And in the late 1930s, of course, Nehru has been put in charge of planning by Bose as well. And so that is the context in which Nehru learns about Mahalanobis. And I recount an episode in which Nehru invites Mahalanobis to come to the Nehru home in Allahabad and discuss planning. And they stay up till 2 a.m. discussing, how the data produced by large-scale sample surveys can help with centralized planning. Nehru, till independence, writes that we want to plan the economy, we want to have a modern economy, but with regard to data, we are in the dark and we are groping in the dark. And in some ways, the National Sample Survey was meant to switch on the lights, to provide policymakers the tools by which they could assess the economy and come up with policies. And those tools could be used for all kinds of, it could be used for whether socialist measures or even capitalist measures, but the tools are necessary because those tools are necessary in modern day United States as much as it is, in modern day China as well. And so I think that it's in that context in which statistics comes to be seen as the solution to the problem of big data. Centralized planning requires big data, and statistics and national sample surveys are the key to unlocking the problem of big data. And of course, Mahalanobis is intrinsically and so fundamentally a part of the national sample survey and of this boom in India's statistical capabilities, that he comes to be seen as an acceptable and as a natural fit for planning. I think that is the context. That's the sort of structural explanation that we need to keep in mind, because I think it's a pretty easy explanation to just say, well, they were friends, and that's why it happened, right? I think that in some ways it's a kind of, maybe even sort of childish way of explaining historical events, to say that, well, X and Y happened, well, because they were friends. Well, why did that not happen? Well, they became enemies after that, right? I think that is it's too simplistic a way of putting these things.
Right.
So next, moving forward, it would be great if you could potentially critique Mahalanobis's understanding of the economy. So let's get this clear, right? So Mahalanobis was a gifted numbers man. He was a great statistician, but he was not an economist. His understanding of the economy was quite rudimentary, in the sense that he thought of it as a large cybernetic engine of sorts with a set of inputs, outputs that could be modeled mathematically, and planners at a top-down level could tweak a couple of inputs, put a little more of A, put a little less of B, and potentially change the net output down the line. Right? That's not how an economy typically works, and that's why he had to face a lot of brickbats from free marketers or liberals like the Shenoys of this world, the Krishnamacharis of this world. Sorry, yeah. So if you could kindly elaborate on that.
Absolutely, I think that this is a very interesting aspect of Mahalanobis, which is that his public persona, as I detailed in my book, is that of a self-sure, cocky, even arrogant personality, right? In Delhi, in the newspapers in Delhi, in the pages of the EPW, then called the Economic Weekly, you hear about Mahalanobis and Pitambar Pant sort of just swatting away ideas by professional economists. There was a regular column called Calcutta Diary in the Economic Weekly, in which people would say that Mahalanobis is just the most spoken about person in Calcutta today, that everybody wants to be a statistician today. Nobody wants to be an economist anymore. But privately, Mahalanobis, through his letters, reveals a much more insecure aspect to his personality. When he's writing to his close friend and confidant, Pitambar Pant, who became, the sort of conduit between the Planning Commission and ISI, he was a sort of secretary at ISI as well. He writes about how he has no training in economics, how he doesn't understand what these Indian economists are writing about, and that he disagrees with them, but that he lacks the training to be able to sort of fight it out with them. And in some ways, his travels abroad, which is sort of frequent, and the ISI journal Sankhya, used to dedicate an entire section to it. Used to be called "Travels Abroad" by Professor Mahalanobis. And so this thing of spending a few months abroad every year was a part of a way for him to get the support of foreign intellectuals on his side in order to battle and wage battle against Indian intellectuals and Indian economists at home. And so the way that Mahalanobis, as he writes and as I quote him in the book, thinks the economy, very often when he would get critiques by professional economists, he would say that all of this is politics. I'm engaged in physics. Like, he would explicitly say that the way he looks at the economy is in terms of physics, in terms of states of being. He would talk about the economy changing, not in terms of a dynamic process, but in terms of it going from one elemental state to another, right? The sort of actual physical transformations in the way that a natural scientist would think of transformation. I talk about how when he's in London, when he meets with economists there, when he's in the Soviet Union, he is thrilled when some of these economists agree with his ideas, because he says that that means that he can come home and wheel and sort of whack that in the face of Indian economists. So when John Robinson from Cambridge says, I can knock some sense into economists at home, he's very thrilled about that, and he writes to Pitambar Pant back in Calcutta about that. Similarly, in the Soviet Union as well, when he sees that economists there agree with him, he's very thrilled. And we must also grant that to some extent, some of his ideas were backed by professional economists, right? The Mahalanobis model, in some ways, is a version of the Harald-Doman model as well. The Feldman model by the Soviet economist is, in a sense, it's referred to today as the Mahalanobis-Feldman model, right? The ideas of input-output tables that he was sort of obsessed with was used by Vasily Leontief, and in fact gave Vasily Leontief one Nobel Prize based on this idea of input-output tables, which was what America's first computers, such as the ones that Howard Aiken was working on in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that was what was used for, like input-output tables to make calculations. Now, of course, America didn't use it to the extent that Mahalanobis wanted to use it in a centralized economy. But so some of these ideas are not, they're not completely off the wall ideas. These are ideas that many professional economists were also advising the Planning Commission, such as Richard Stone, such as Gunnar Myrdal, such as Raoul Prebisch's ideas been in consonance to some extent with Mahalanobis's as well. So there are lots of these professional economists who do agree in some ways with what Mahalanobis is arguing. The critique from the right, the economic conservative right or the free market right, in some ways is perhaps best made by somebody who was then a young economist who came to India and then went on to become a celebrity economist and one of the sort of most famous economists of the 20th century, Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman visits India in 1955, quickly realizes that there's no place for him here, that everybody disagrees with him. And Milton Friedman at the time himself was not the mainstream in America. That's what we have to remember. John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a Harvard economist and then became an ambassador to India, was actually a much more considered closer to the mainstream of economic opinion in America at the time. And John Kenneth Galbraith was a supporter of the state playing an important role in the economy. Milton Friedman wasn't. In fact, there's a funny episode I recount in the book in which Mahalanobis, on one of his travels, is in Switzerland, in Geneva, I believe, and he meets with John Kenneth Galbraith there. And Mahalanobis says, I've written to the U.S. government, and they've promised to send this brilliant young economist named Milton Friedman to come and advise Indian economic policy. And Galbraith laughs and says that getting Milton Friedman to advise on a planned economy is like asking the Pope to advise on family planning, right? And so Mahalanobis is sort of, laughs at that and is amused enough to invite Galbraith instead. But Milton Friedman's critique after having met Mahalanobis was that Mahalanobis was, he admitted, a brilliant man, a brilliant mathematician. And he says that there is an issue that often plagues brilliant mathematicians when they approach the economy, which is that because they have been used to, and he says, I'm sort of paraphrasing, he says that because gifted young mathematicians are used to solving problems at a very young age and having very clear-cut solutions to them that are black and white, they imagine that translates to something like the economy, in which things are not black and white. And he then quotes Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations to say that the problem with the policymaker who believes that they can control everything is that they believe they're like a chess player and that they are controlling all of the sort of the pieces on the chessboard, whereas actually you do not have that kind of control because you are yourself a part of the chessboard, right? That you are yourself a part of this very, very dynamic situation. And so I think that is the fundamental Milton Friedman, but also Hayekian critique of centralized planning. Of course, the Hayekian critique of centralized planning goes further and is rooted in a fear of the Soviet Union and of all centralized planning, according to him, leading eventually to totalitarianism, the road to serfdom, as he puts it in his book, right?
So the crux would be essentially, to quote Hayek, the various ways in which the knowledge on which people base their plans is communicated to them is the crucial problem for any theory explaining the economic process and the process of what is the best way of utilizing knowledge initially dispersed among all the people is at least one of the main problems of economic policy or of designing efficient economic systems. So that's essentially what he mentions in his famous essay, The Use of Knowledge in a Society.
Yeah, and so to him, the idea is that the problem with this is not just that, as you point out, that it becomes inefficient in terms of a policy standpoint, but to him, the greater danger is that he thinks that fascism Nazism and Soviet totalitarianism result from this kind of centralized planning, right? So to him, that is the real danger. And of course, in India, I don't think that critique didn't pan out, because India remained a liberal democracy, right? And the reason that India had the emergency was certainly not because of centralized planning, right? That is a different kind of threat. Yeah. And so I think that in some ways, the Milton Friedman critique perhaps in some ways is more appropriate than the Hayekian critique of it. But the Hayekian critique comes from an early 20th century debate, which is often referred to as the sort of socialist calculation debate, which is precisely this, what you mentioned, Srinjoy, that how do you best aggregate information in an economy? And so some people like Austrian economists von Mises or Hayek argued that it's impossible to aggregate enough information for a central planner to efficiently plan an economy. Whereas others like Oscar Lange, more socialist economists, argued that actually, ultimately, it's just a series of simultaneous equations, and that if you had enough information, then you could do it. And that if you could do it, it would be so much better than having a free market. And of course, the retort from the other side was that, well, which human being can do that, right? How can you actually ever do that? Which is why the computer, and the computer plays a role in my book as well, the computer presents itself as a solution to these socialist-minded economists. To Oscar Lange and etc., they're saying, well, now we have the solution. Like, no one human being can do it, but you can input all these simultaneous equations into a computer. And of course, as computers then were less powerful than the phone I'm holding in my hand, it would take maybe like half an hour. But in a half an hour, you would have a solution to a very complex problem, right? And so, so in some ways, that's how the computer comes to play a role in this debate about socialist calculation.
Yeah, so this is probably the right time to talk about the first Indian computer. That's probably sort of resulted from all this need for processing the massive amount of data for planning.
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about how computers come to India not through the routes that we would commonly associate with it. I argue that we think of the 1980s as the period in which India sort of undergoes a computer revolution. Rajiv Gandhi is considered the sort of Mr. Computer, whereas actually that is a distinction that should go to Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute. And TIFR, of course, builds India's first digital advanced domestic-made computer. But the first digital computers to be operated in India are both at the ISI campus in Baranagar in outside Calcutta. And these are actually two of the first, outside of Japan, no other Asian country had digital computers at the time.
That's JUSI, right? It's called JUSI, right?
ECJU.
No, that's the Jadavpur one. That's the Jadavpur one, which is actually what came up in the late 1950s. But before that, the HEC-2M, the Hollerith Electronic Computer 2M, was the first digital computer to be used on Indian soil, and the second one was the Ural, which came from the Soviet Union. Both of which were housed in air-conditioned units on ISI's campus. The Jadavpur one, the JSUI, comes up later. But the JSUI comes up after the TIFR is developed in Bombay. So both these first computers are brought to India by Mahalanobis. Mahalanobis spearheads this mission, and they're brought to India, paid for by the government of India, but housed on ISI's campus. Mahalanobis insists that the government of India should own them, but they'll be operated by ISI. And they're brought using the argument that India needs to develop its economy. India has a centralized planning economy. The planning economy needs to crunch numbers because of big data, and the computers are necessary for it. Every other country to which the computer first comes, whether it is in the countries of its origin, like Britain or America or Japan or Germany, all the other countries that are using it primarily for defense purposes, to calculate ballistic ranges, etc. Whereas India is actually making a very different argument, and which is why India is actually going hand in hand to these aid agencies and saying, and Mahalanobis is on this petitionary cause for years and years, writing to different aid agencies saying, can you help us with this? We're not trying to use it for military purposes, but we're trying to use it for development purposes. And so I chart the story of these two different computers coming to India, about how India, these computers cost $1 million. I mean, it's hard to believe, but one computer, which has the capability less than of the laptops on which we're having this conversation, but those cost $1 million, and $1 million in the 1950s, right? At a time when India's forex and exchange reserves were very low. So it was a big deal to even convince the Indian government that India should invest in them. And the Indian government actually said, we can't actually invest in it. So what we will do is we will make it an official request to the UN, to other aid agencies, so they can pay for it, for India to get it as part of a sort of aid package. And that's how these computers come to India. The Ural, which is the second computer that comes to India, comes from the Soviet Union. And there's a funny story behind it, which is that at the time in the mid-1950s, Stalin is still alive. In the early 1950s, Stalin is still alive. It's not clear. There's a complete blackout on all information about the computer because it's seen as so sensitive information. So it's seen as in the Cold War, you have to protect all information that you have about the computer. So when Mahalanobis is invited to a sort of lunch party with the Soviet delegation at the Prime Minister's residence, he finds himself, I believe he found a way to get himself seated next to the Soviet ambassador, Mikhail Menshikov. And Mikhail Menshikov is sitting next to him, and Mahalanobis leans over and says, how about sharing a computer with us? And he sort of doesn't lie, but he says that the Americans are willing to grant us one. At the time, the Americans had not really granted them one, but they were in conversations. And he says, well, if the Americans are willing to grant us one, why wouldn't the Soviet Union grant us one? After all, we are, ideologically more aligned towards you. And Menshikov then laughs and says, well, why don't you send in a formal proposal? And then Mahalanobis races that evening to Nehru's residence and makes Nehru write a letter. And the next day morning, he goes to Palam Airport and personally hands over a letter. And a few years later, Mahalanobis is in Moscow, gets a tour of these computers, and then the Ural comes to India eventually. And as I also recount, there are funny episodes about how the Ural comes to India, but of course, none of the ISI engineers know how to speak or read Russian. And so they don't know how to operate the machine. And so the computer comes with two Soviet engineers who translate some of it, who teach some ISI engineers some basic Russian in order to be able to read parts of the manual. So I think there's some very interesting episodes related to the computers coming to India. And one of the most interesting episodes, of course, is, I think, that of an American computer called the UNIVAC, which had become very globally popular at the time. In fact, it shows up in a Bugs Bunny cartoon as well as it's called, I think, the Brain Machine, something of that sort. And this is a machine that Mahalanobis wanted for almost a decade, but never really got. And the reason was that I found, and so the irony is that Mahalanobis was never aware of this. I don't think so.
He was considered a commie, probably.
Exactly. That the State Department. So when I went to, so he might have suspected it, but he never had, I think, proof of it, nor did the Indian government. But when I went to now recently declassified documents between the State Department in Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Embassy in Delhi, there are these letters which basically says that the professor is, we believe, a part of a communist apparatus, that he might be a beachhead for Soviet, intervention in Indian affairs. And there's no point giving this valuable machine to them. And so,
is that the high time
but on the other,
McCarthyism going on in the
exactly,
US?
Yeah. So McCarthyism is, the Red Scare is on in the United States. McCarthyism is on in the United States. And in some ways you feel bad for the professor because he's unaware of it. And at the same time in the archives I can read, at the ISI archives, I can read Mahalanobis sort of pleading with different aid agencies in the United States, saying, can you give it to us? And they write back saying, yes, this seems like a very good cause and we will give it. But in the end, what happens is that it gets sort of nixed at the very top, where they're saying, no, we can give it to other institutions, but not to Mahalanobis. But Mahalanobis, of course, is the person who's leading the charge. And so unwittingly, the person who was most responsible for bringing the computers also becomes the primary hindrance to one of the computers coming to India.
On this thread, Nikhil, it would be great if you could just recount the story of one Mortimer Nadler. So that story, personally, I felt it's straight out of a John le Carre or an Ian Rankin Cold War spy thriller. So it would be great if you could, in brief, just recount that story for our listeners.
Absolutely. In fact, Mortimer Nadler himself says of his own life that it began to resemble that a John le Carre spy thriller. Oh. So Mortimer Nadler was a young Jewish boy from Brooklyn who had since moved to work on radar systems in Chicago, but he was I say but because it was not approved of at the time. He was a young communist and was part of the U.S. Communist Party in the late 1930s and early 1940s. He decides, because he's an idealistic young communist, and he believes that he is not able to proceed in his career because of his ideological leanings. He decides to move behind the Iron Curtain to, the promised Soviet land. And so he tells his parents that he's going to go and do a PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris, but actually he goes to Paris and then takes a flight to Czechoslovakia to work, in a communist country. And there he becomes an expert in the early generation of experts in studying computers and working on computers, and his life really becomes this quite amazing spy thriller, because once it becomes clear that he's gone to the Soviets, he's writing letters to his parents, but his mother is passing on those letters to the FBI. Morton Adler is not aware of this, but his mother's passing it on to his FBI. His father disapproves of his mother doing it, but his rabbi approves. His mother's rabbi approves of it. So J. Edgar Hoover is getting all these letters that are coming from this person, because America now thinks of him as a traitor, as potentially a traitor, as passing on American radar secrets. At the same time, because this is these sort of Byzantine structures of secrecy, etc., the Czechoslovakian government also suspects, well, what if he's a double agent? Like, what if we think he's moved to our side, but actually he's been planted here by Edgar Hoover? So unbeknownst to Morton Adler, they have their own spies tailing Morton Adler. They sort of set up what are called, what has been called sort of honey traps. They set up sort of lovers for him in order that he gets into relationships with them, and then they sort of report back to the secret police in Czechoslovakia on it. He had a sort of code name. He finds out later that their view of him was that he was a crude American who loved money and women, and those were his weaknesses. But at some point, after especially the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, he becomes disillusioned. He becomes disillusioned with communism. He also begins to see a lot of anti-Semitism within the upper levels of the party hierarchy. And, but he's such a committed communist that he names his second daughter Maya after Mao Zedong. But, again, the reason I have all this knowledge is because Morton Adler later on in his elderly age, he submits Freedom of Information requests from the American government and gets all this sort of data on himself. But he did not know that he was seen in this way by the American government. He applies to get his passport back, and the American government says, no, we can't give you a passport back unless you buy a one-way ticket back to the United States. So all this is happening, and at some point he realizes, okay, I need to leave this place. But of course, it's not as easy to leave this place once you're seen as working for the Czech government, and you're seen as a spy both by the country that you've adopted and the country that you've left, right? So he can't fly back directly to the United States because they think that now he's a spy. So his friends tell him that what you need to do is to find a non-aligned country to go to, in a sense, to get a cooling off period where people believe that, well, if you're working in a non-aligned country, you're neither here nor there. And so as it happens, Mahalanobis shows up in Prague, and he realizes, okay, this is my ticket out. That if I can convince Mahalanobis, who's at that time, seen as a very important figure, has the ear of Prime Minister Nehru, if I can get him to invite me to India and I can spend a few years there, that will, in a sense, wash the stain of communism off me. And so that's what he does. And so Mahalanobis helps him jump through the bureaucratic hoops. The Czech government is still not very keen on letting him go because they feel like, he might be going with some secrets of ours, but they feel like, well, at least he's going to India, which is, sort of aligned with the Soviet Union, but it's not aligned as well. And so that's how he ends up working in Calcutta for 2 years on India's first computers.
Fascinating.
One segment that we definitely should discuss is the fact that Nehruvianism, that at that point of time entailed the invocation of a number of popular icons and figures to kind of drive plan consciousness among the people. As you have so adroitly described in your book, they wanted to have this clean demarcation between planning in a communist country versus planning in a democratic country. Although the plans would be framed by those people at the top, all the citizens should be given an impression that they are integral cogs in the wheel that makes this plan reach fruition. So if you could probably discuss a couple of those initiatives in brief details, that would be great.
Absolutely. So the entire second half of my book is about this idea called democratic planning. And democratic planning was the idea that that Indian 5-year plans were and had to be different from communist 5-year plans. That there was this mixture of idealism about democracy and popular participation, but also a realistic understanding that Indian plans just could not succeed if Indian citizens did not voluntarily participate in it. That the Indian state apparatus, that Indian state capacity was just such that it could not succeed in quite the same way unless there was some kind of planned consciousness. That's the term they use, that there was planned consciousness and there was democratic planning. So there were two aspects to it. One is to demarcate India from totalitarian countries. The other aspect was to try to generate this kind of social movement to help with the plans becoming successful. The examples of the ways in which the Indian government went about it, and it's quite extraordinary the amount of effort and money and time that was put into it. And over 2 chapters, I recount how this included entire units within the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, such as roving publicity officers who went around the country traveling on bullock cart units, on jeep units, on boat units, on railway units, carrying publicity materials to far corners of India, carrying small film projectors in which they would go to a village and on a film projector, maybe on some sort of cloth, they'd put up, screen some movie, that may be a silent movie or a movie in the local language, dubbed in the local language, about the Panchvarsha Yojana, about the 5-year plans and what's happening with them. There was a song and drama division that was created, which is of entirely professional drama troops and singing troops, in which they would try to put the message of the plan into a simple drama, so that these dramatic troops could go to a village and perform this theatrical play. But the play would be about the themes of the 5-year plan. There were university planning forums set up across the country, in which every college and every university had a planning forum where they would discuss and debate ideas about the plan. And the very idealistic vision was that these debates, would be aggregated, say, from different colleges in their university, would be aggregated to the DU level. And from there, be aggregated to the level in which they could then discuss it and forward their ideas to the planning commission. Well, nothing of that sort happened, really. But the idea was that this would be in some ways a consultative process, a process of debate, in which, unlike in the Soviet 5-year plans, in which it brooked no debate, here you could be a student in a university and say that I hate the second 5-year plan, I think it's nonsense. But theoretically, that's possible. But apart from these government ventures, the government also tried to get voluntary contributions from the citizens of India. And I found these some of the most fascinating examples of democratic planning. So one is an organization called the Bharatevaksamaj, which was a vast sort of NGO of sorts, which basically aggregated people who wanted to donate time and money in order to build things like a local dispensary or a local hospital, or build a part of a road, or wanted to help, build a part of an embankment for a river that had been eroded. You could be part of the Bharatevaksamaj, and this is a kind of Gandhian organization of offering your labor, a sort of shramdan, right? That's the idea, the Gandhian idea of offering your shram, of your hard work, to the cause of national development. And perhaps the most fascinating episode in this is something called the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which is the Indian Association of Ascetics. The Bharat Sadhu Samaj was this body of sadhus, 50 sadhus, who met with the then Minister of Planning and Industry, Gulzarilal Nanda, in 1956 at Birla Mandir, a temple to Vishnu and Lakshmi. And the idea was that the government and the Bharat Sadhu Samaj would be engaged in a joint venture in which the sadhus would try to propagate the ideas of the 5-year plan using Hindu idioms and imagery. And so you can imagine how this kind of zany ideas that this puts together. So then you have the sadhus at the Kumbh Mela, right? Sadhus who've dedicated their lives to being non-material, spreading the message of a very materialistic 5-year plan, using language of the Mahabharata, of the Ramayana. And it also leads to, I think, in a sense, a misstep by the Congress in terms of associating themselves with people whose ulterior motives or pet projects were very different from that of the Congress party, right? So in 1966, you see this boomerang hitting the Congress in its face when the sadhus march on the parliament, and we have the first attack on parliament because of a march is due to as part of an anti-cow slaughter movement. Right. And they attack parliament, the police is called in, tear gas is fired, live ammunition is fired, several people die, 80 people are injured. large parts of central Delhi, including Connaught Place, etc., vandalized. Congress ministers' homes are attacked, and it leads to a humiliation for Gulzar Lal Nanda, who had been a patron of these causes and is at that point the home minister of the country. And so he is forced to step down and resign. But what also happens, as I point out in the book, is that one of the key figures who was at that meeting in 1956 at Birla Mandir, Tukdoji Maharaj, becomes one of the founder vice presidents of the VHP, of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, right? Because you can see why the sadhus would be attracted to that kind of political ideology. And of course, we know that the VHP over time in the 1980s and 1990s becomes the core force behind the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, the Ayodhya movement, which we've seen the apogee of today with Babri Masjid coming down, and now the Supreme Court saying that a temple can be rebuilt over the ruins of Babri Masjid. And the Bharatevaksamaj, which was basically a creature of the Congress party, to the extent that the Jansangh used to critique the Bharatevaksamaj as being Congress sadhus. Well, these Congress sadhus by the 1980s are very much part of the Ayodhya movement.
Right. So one personal recollection, I think that was a phase where Dilip Kumar was widely considered to be the Nehruvian hero who would always stand for progress and development. And that's a theme that consistently played out movie after movie, the only exception being Naya Daur, where at the end, in the bullock cart versus motor car race, the bullock cart wins, the motor car loses out. And I don't know, my interpretation of that was Indians would probably accept development and modernization, but on their own terms, in steady speeds, not in one go. That was my interpretation of it. The last question for you, Nikhil, is it's basically a long run question of sorts. Let's go back to those years where India is potentially carrying out its first gargantuan national census. It's receiving acclaim from across the board, from statisticians across the board, from governments across the board. China under Zhou Enlai is sending envoys to India so that these envoys can learn some of the best practices in statistics by looking at what's being done in India. Cut to 2019, where the government, before the impending Lok Sabha election, stops the release of a particular data set which lists the jobs data over the years, and that data is quite unsavory towards the government's achievements. And that has a number of experts in India and abroad question the independence of India's statistical bodies. So this is quite a huge contrast, right? From being at the forefront of statistical planning and at the forefront of data systems to being a country where the basic premise or the basic foundation underlying these data systems is being questioned. If you could you profess a couple of reasons why you feel this change happened?
Yeah, I think that some of it has to do with, I do not think that it has to do with a change in economic ideology necessarily. I think that you can have an advanced capitalist system and have very good, data system. In fact, that is what capitalist economists who believe in the market argue for. That is what, say, advanced capitalist economies like Britain and America and the United States strive for, right? That it's not as if because they are advanced capitalist economies that they therefore say we don't need good data. In fact, having good data, a timely series of data, and a transparent data that outsiders outside the government can inspect and use for their research is seen as part of having a robust digital infrastructure. Now, India, despite not being an advanced economy, had that. And that was why it was seen by economists and statisticians across the world as a real jewel in India's sort of, social scientific crown. It was hailed by statisticians at the time, like Edward Deming, as he put it, as where Mahalanobis and India led, the rest of the world followed. Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton has talked about how India really was one of the leaders in this exercise, and that the rest of the world really, including the World Bank surveys today, use a lot of what the ISI and Mahalanobis pioneered in Calcutta and then in India with the National Sample Survey. It's been something that other economists, ranging from Planning Commission economists like Abhijit Sen or JNU economists to MIT economists, Abhijit Banerjee, a range of economists across different ideological persuasions have said that this was a signal achievement for post-colonial India, and that this is being steadily deteriorated over the last 5 or 6 years. So
Right.
I don't think that the deterioration is necessarily because India liberalized its economy. Like, that's not the reason why. I think that what is happening is that good data, as I write in my book, is not always good politics. And there is an embarrassment for the government when the government's own figures shows that the economy is not doing nearly as well as the government's leaders are saying. And so the report that you said was suppressed in 2019 was a National Sample Survey report from 2017, 2018 that said that unemployment was at a 40-year high, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was going into a general election in 2019. And so you can see why. I'm not saying that that's justified, not at all, but you can comprehend why the incentives play such that a government might want to suppress it and say that actually there's problems with the methodology of it. After that, there's been other surveys that were conducted by the government, such as household consumption survey, that has been discontinued by the government. Again, when the findings were leaked, it was found that it was household consumption had been seen to have dropped to a 30-year low. Again, something that's not flattering to the government. So I think that what's happening is, and again, many governments in the past have intervened in different ways, but what we see now is an inflection point in which this kind of data is being steadily degraded, and when it is appropriate for the government, or when it shows government in a flattering light, they're willing to release it, but otherwise they're willing to suppress it. And I think that the reason for that is that it's part and parcel of this government's larger attitude towards experts and expertise. You might disagree with Nehruvian economic policies. You might say that, and you might have a good argument to make that many wrong decisions were made. But I think that you would have to admit that Nehru was deferring to professional expertise. B.R. Shenoy, who disagreed with Nehru's plans, was still on the panel of experts that Nehru sent the second 5-year plan draft to. And B.R. Shenoy, therefore, submitted a note of dissent. But he was one out of 21 who dissented. 20 other economists said that it was the right way to move forward. And so I think that what you see today is that, and we see this, across the board. It's not just in economics. It's in, we've seen in the last 5 years, 2 central bankers, heads of the RBI have resigned due to differences of opinion, perceived differences of opinion with the government. Raghuram Rajan, Urjit Patel. We've seen an entire university being demonized, JNU, my alma mater, the jailing of critics of government who are intellectuals. We've seen that we now don't have firm baselines for poverty assessments, despite the government claiming that it has made these record achievements in poverty alleviation. This is something that one of the leaders in studying global poverty, Martin Rebellion of the Center of Global Development, has talked about, that India basically, you can't say that India has not done it, but you can't say that India has done it either, because we just don't have the data. Like, on what basis can you make this claim? And so these criticisms are not just from me. I mean, these criticisms come from people who have a lot more professional expertise in these fields. But also, again, like I said, whether it's universities, whether it's independent intellectuals, whether it is in my own field in history, you see with the Indian Council of Historical Research a very open agenda to make Indian history fit Hindu nationalist themes. And so I think that this is a more generalized attack on experts, technocrats, and expertise. This is a government that is either very suspicious of experts, who they think of as anglicized, deracinated intellectuals who don't have the pulse of the people, or they're outrightly dismissive of them, or they outrightly denigrate them. Right? I mean, famously, Prime Minister Modi said, we believe in hard work, not Harvard. Of course, I don't see them as necessarily being in any tension with each other. You can be a graduate of Harvard as well. But so I think that this is generally a more widespread phenomenon that you see across different fields, across intellectual subdisciplines in India, that the government is not comfortable with independent-minded intellectuals. And I think the most cataclysmic example of that, as I mentioned before, was demonetization. I mean, can you imagine any country of comparable size? Of course, there are not many countries of comparable size, but any country making such a monumental decision based on not having the professional opinion of even one economist. Right? I mean, not a single economist has raised a hand and said we would have recommended the way that this was carried out. but it was carried out. And in fact, the Prime Minister often touts this as one of the best features of his policies, which is that it's not corrupted by these foreign educated, these anglicized intellectuals who are part of the establishment from before. So I think that, yes, there is a danger to excessive technocratism. There is a danger to people like Mahalanobis getting excessive powers, that it must be kept in check with democratic forces. But I think that there is, right now, what we face is very much a danger in the opposite direction.
Yeah, in fact, demonetization, I think Abhijit Banerjee was mentioning in one of his talks that it's a bad economic decision, but it was a good politics in certain sense that, it's perceived by the common people as a thing that it was needed to be done for punishing, all the rich holding a lot of, black money and so on, right? So that's
exactly. But again, embarrassingly for the government's own data suggests that 3 years on, almost all that black money was accounted for.
Exactly.
There was no
99%. Right? There is a number. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and of course, the Prime Minister promised that all of us Indian citizens will get 15 lakh rupees once that black money was. I'm still waiting for it. I don't know about you.
Thank you, Nikhil. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for so much for your time. Wishing you all the best for your future projects. What are you working on at the moment? If you could share it with us.
Right now, I am. I'd rather keep it to myself because it's just very much in its infant stages, and so I'm traveling soon to India to work at the archives. But it's so much in its infancy that it would be premature of me to say anything about it. So let's see where it takes.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for having me. Srinjoy and Pratyay, it's been a real pleasure to be here, and all the best with your podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Right. Bye.